Hi, welcome to .NET Tricks ASP.NET Web API 2 Interview Question Answer Series. My name is Shailin Chauhan. I am Microsoft MVP, Technical Consultant and Coordinator. Here I prepared a course for you where I am covering the commonly asked interview question answer on ASP.NET Web API 2 so that you can prepare you for the next job interview on ASP.NET Web API. I hope these set of question answer definitely will help you. If you want to get the such type of videos in future also, I request you to please do subscribe to .NET X YouTube channel and click the bell icon so that you will get notified in the future when I will publish the such content for you. If you like this set of question answer, please do mention in the comment section below. And if you need any other set of question answer, I will prepare for you. So let's get started. Question answer about REST and Web API. So let's see what type of question can be asked to you about the REST architecture and the ASP.NET Web API. So let's move to the first question, like what is SOA, or like it can be like what is service oriented architecture. So service oriented architecture is an architecture design pattern which states that every component of a system should be a service. So what are the application you are building? So all the layers in your application should be a service, and the system should be composed of several loosely coupled services. It means the services should be independent. So if you are doing the change in one of the service, so that change should not impact the another service. In service oriented architecture, we use WSDL. If you are willing to find out what are the various methods are there in the services, because it is going to describe our services. Even it is containing the information about how to make a connection with the service. The second one is a UDDI. UDDI stands for Universal Description, Discovery and Integration. And it is an XML based standard for describing, publishing and finding your web services over the internet. The third one is a SOAP. So SOAP stands for a Simple Object Access Protocol, which we use for the communication between the client and services. And here in service oriented architecture, the data is transferred as a SOAP message, and that SOAP message is a XML based message over there. In .NET, web services and the WCF are based upon the service oriented architecture. Now let's move to the next question. What is REST architecture, or you can say the RESTful architecture? So REST is an architecture style to describe a hypermedia distributed system such as web, and the REST is based upon the following principle. So first one is the addressable resources. So each resource should be identified by a URI, and in fact URI is a combination of URL plus HTTP verb. So whatever the resource you are going to access over the internet, that should have a unique URI. The second one is a simple and uniform interfaces. You should always keep your interfaces simple and uniform, and this simplicity and uniformity can be achieved by using the HTTP protocol and HTTP protocol method, because HTTP protocol is known to everyone. So for accessing, or you can say for consuming the REST API, we don't need any specific language and framework. Anyway, the REST APIs can be consumed with the help of the style of consuming the HTTP based services. The next one is here the representation oriented. So in case of REST, you need to just exchange the data. The next one is here representation oriented. So here we are exchanging the representation of data, and the data representation can be in XML format, it can be in JSON format. Just like service oriented architecture, we never share here service schema, because there we share the service schema using the WSDL, but here we are not sharing the service schema. We are just sharing the data in XML or JSON format, unlike any other format. The next one is communicate stateless. So here the communication would be here stateless. So there is no way to maintain the session over there. If there is a requirement occurred, so every time the client need to send the session with the request. So session in specific information that client need to store at its end, and it's sent to the server every time with the request. The next principle is a cacheable. So the client should able to cache the response of the service so that the client can use it for the further use. So this is the principle Whatever the services is following are known as RESTful services. So when we say this is a REST service, so all the REST services are following this principle. So this is about the REST architecture you need to explain. Now let's move to the next question. What is the ASP.NET Web API? So ASP.NET Web API is a framework for building the HTTP services. And ASP.NET Web API is based upon the RESTful architecture, which we discussed in the previous slide. And the Web API is based upon the RESTful architecture. So that's why we use a REST protocol standard verb like get, post, put, delete, head, patch, like any other verb we use. And Web API support the multiple text format. Like here we can export the data in XML format or like in JSON format. And it is completely stateless. Even it support the ASP.NET MVC features like controller, action, routing, filters, authentication, authorization. So we having the same concept as we use in ASP.NET MVC. Even it support the self-hosting and IIS hosting as well. So in the case of ASP.NET Web API, you don't need to follow the separate style as we follow in WCF and the web services. It is having the almost same syntax as we use in ASP.NET MVC 5. Now let's move to the next question, like when to use WCF over the Web API. So sometimes the people compare the WCF with the Web API. Now let's understand what are the use cases where the WCF is helpful. So WCF we should use to support the special scenarios like one-way messaging, message queue, and duplex communication. If these cases are needed, there you should use the WCF. Even to support the fastest transport channels available. Sometimes it happens we having a service and that service you might be exposing through the STD protocol. Now you have linked to use the fastest transport channel like TCP/IP and named pipe. So there WCF can be used. So whenever there is a requirement to expose the same services over the multiple protocol like HTTP, TCP and the named pipe and MSMQ, there you should use WCF. Because the REST API we can use only with HTTP protocol. Now let's move to the next question, like when to use Web API over the WCF. So whenever you are willing to use the HTTP protocol, all features like URIs, request response headers, caching, versioning, various content formats, their Web API you should use. And whenever you are willing to expose your service to a broad range of clients, including browsers, mobile apps, desktop application, because the REST APIs we can consume easily by using the HTTP protocol style. Even the Web API can be used to export the data in many formats like XML, JSON, text, like any other format. But in case of WCF, we only export the data in XML format, and that is the SOAP envelope, the SOAP style. So size of the data in case of SOAP base style is bigger than this JSON based style, let's say this XML based style. The next question is here, what is the difference between the ASP.NET MVC and ASP.NET Web API? So if you look at the ASP.NET MVC closely, ASP.NET MVC used to create the UI which can return the data as well as view. While Web API we use only to return the data over the HTTP protocol. Web API cannot be used to return the view. The second difference is here, in ASP.NET MVC requests are mapped to the action name, whereas in ASP.NET MVC, wherein ASP.NET Web API request is mapped to the action based on the action HTTP verb. So ultimately there is a resource in ASP.NET Web API, and when we are saying the resource having an endpoint, and that endpoint is actually having a combination of our verb and the URL. So here routing is not exactly same as we have in ASP.NET MVC, where in the URL usually we having the action name, we having the controller name, and based upon that the request mapping done over there. But here the request mapping is done based upon the HTTP protocol verb. So explicitly we do mention the verb name, like how this action should respond in the Web API to a particular verb. But there by default any action can respond to the get and the post verb. But in ASP.NET Web API explicitly we need to tell the verb name to respond by the action. Even ASP.NET MVC uses the system.web.mvc namespace, while Web API uses the system.web.mvc HTTP namespace. So what are the model binding, what are the filters, routing and others features we are using in WebAPI, we use from the system.web.http namespace, and in MVC5 we use the same thing from the system.web.mvc namespace. So there are two separate namespaces are used in MVC and in WebAPI. Question answer about request and response. So let's start with the first question, like what are the HTTP verbs, or you can say the request verbs. So in RESTful services, to perform the CRUD operation, it is suggested to use the specific HTTP verb when we make the request. So the commonly used HTTP verbs are here. Get verb we use. So get verb we use to retrieve the data, or you can say resource from the server. We use head verb. Head verb is identical to get verb, but here we didn't receive the data in the request in the response body. So without response body, we get the response from the server. The next one is a post verb, and the post verb we use to send data to the server so that we can create a resource. The next verb is a put. So put is also used to send the data to the server, but it is used to update or replace a resource at the database level. So whenever there is a requirement to update or replace a resource, you should use the put verb over there. The next one is a patch verb. So patch verb send only change data to the server so that you can partially update or modify the existing resource. So there is a difference between put and patch. In put, we set the complete record, like in the complete resource information to the server for modification purpose. But in case of patch, we only send that data that is modified, not the entire resource. That's why patch is for partial update and put it here for full update. The next verb is a delete. So delete verb we use to delete the resource at a specified URI. And there is one more thing you should understand about the HTTP verbs, that is idempotent. So here we have been get, head, put and delete. So these two verbs are idempotent. It means whenever you are making the request, you are getting the same data every time. But in case of post, in case of patch, these are not the idempotent method, because in case of post, if you are sending the same data again, it will create a new record. That record can be duplicate, but ultimately it's at a new row over there. But if the same thing you will do in case of get, you will get the identical record from the API. Same thing we having for patch as well. So when you are using the patch, so when the same data you are sending to the server for the modification purpose, so it will modify the things over there. The next question is what is the request header? So request header is used to provide the additional information related to the request. For example, to get the response in JSON format, we need to set the accept header when we are making the request to the ASP.NET Web API. So this is the way how we can make the request, and in the request header we can pass the accept header with the value application/JSON. So this is an example where we can use where we can make the request. And nowadays the request we made using the REST client like Postman. Even you can make the request using the filter as well. Whenever you are using the different methods like get, post, put and delete. The next question is what is the request body and response body? So request body contains the data which you are willing to send to the server when you are making a request. So this is the way what I'm doing here. I'm just making a post request to the given URL, and here in the request body I'm sending the data in the JSON format. I'm sending here ID as 1, name as Shailendra. Even the same request I can use to send the data using the x-www.form-URL encoded, because the data using the request body we can pass as a JSON format. We can pass by using the x-www.form-URL encoded format. So we having the various way to send the data in the request body. It can be JSON, it can be XML, it can be any other format. And when we talking about the response body, so it contains the data sent by the server to the client. So we having the response body in that case. So response server can send in JSON format, it can send in the XML format. It's up to how you are requesting the data in the REST API. Now let's move to the next question, like what are the HTTP status code? So when we get the response from the server, in the response we get the 3-digit integer number. So which is actually the status code of our request. Or you can say when we getting the response, so the response containing the status code. So the first digit in the status code define the class of the response. So we having the response header. So response header of each response contain the HTTP status code. And we having the range of the HTTP status code, like if it is starting from 1, so it is going to tell us the response is a informational type. So all the informational related response return the status code as 100, 101, 102 like this way. Then we having the success status code. So if the status code is starting from the 2 as a number, let's say 200, 201, 202. So these are going to represent the success response. If the status code is starting from the 3, let's say 301, 302. So these are going to represent the redirection, like the resource is going to redirect to some other URL. If it is going to return as response code as 400, 404, like 405, it is going to represent the client side error, like something which we are requesting is not correct. If we are getting the response code, let's say 500, 501, ultimately it is going to start with number as 5. So it is a server side error. Like while processing the request, there is an error in the code at server side. So these are the status code which is going to tell us what is happening with the response. So 1 for informational, 2nd for the success, 3rd for the redirection, 4 for the client side error, and the 5 for the server side error. Question answer about controller and action result. So first question is about here how the WebAPI controller is different from the MVC5 controller. So now let's compare the WebAPI controller with the MVC5. So in the WebAPI, everything is going to inherit from the system.web.http namespace. So WebAPI2 controller actually derives from system.web.http.api controller class. But in MVC5, the controller is going to inherit from the system.web.mvc namespace controller class. So in WebAPI2, the action name either start with the HTTP verb or we apply the HTTP verb attribute. So when we are defining our method name, it should be like this way: get all, get data, post data, put data, delete data. So either do prefix the HTTP verb name or either decorate the action name with the HTTP verb, like HTTP get, HTTP post, HTTP delete. But in MVC we don't have such things, because by default the MVC action we can call by making the get and the post request. But if you are willing to apply the restriction only for calling that method for a particular verb, in that case only we can decorate the action with the appropriate verb, like HTTP get, post and delete. So WebAPI2 action is specialized in returning the data. We never return the view from the WebAPI action. And the MVC action is actually specialized in rendering the view. But from the MVC action we can return data also, like JSON data, string data, like any other data. But from WebAPI we cannot return the view. And WebAPI, when return the data in JSON format or in XML format, depend upon the request accept header. So when we make the request to the server, so we can send the accept header to tell to the WebAPI in which format we are willing to receive the data. The MVC return the action result or any other drive type. It can be view result, it can be partial view result, it can be the JSON result. Now let's move to the next question. What action result supported by the WebAPI2? So WebAPI2 support the void as a return type. So when you are mentioning the void as a return type for your WebAPI action, it return the empty to not for status code. It means no content. It return HTTP response message. So initially when the WebAPI 1 was introduced, that time we use HTTP response message. But starting from WebAPI 2, commonly we use IHttpAction Result, but still WebAPI to support the HTTP response message class as a return type. So it convert directly to an HTTP response message. So whatever the data we are having, that is going to be converted into the HTTP response message. The widely used return type in WebAPI 2 is here IHttpAction Result, which call the execute async method to create an HTTP response message. So ultimately IHttpAction Result return type is going to be create behind the scene HTTP response message with the help of HTTP response message class. So IHttpAction Result is a wrapper around the HTTP response message, which create the HTTP response by executing the execute async method. Even you can use some other type as well, where you can return the status code as 200. Now let's move to the next question, like what are the advantages of using the IHttpAction Result? So the advantage of using the IHttpAction Result is here, it separates the common logic for creating the HTTP response. Because in WebAPI 1 what happens, we create the HTTP response at the action label, there we return the data. But in IHttpAction Result, we are separating that thing. Even it simplified the unit testing as well, because for writing the unit testing for your WebAPI action, the code should be loosely coupled. So the action should have the single responsibility. Even it uses the async and await by default. So if you are willing to make the request in asynchronous format, so there also it will help you. So we can use over there the asynchronous programming of the C# to make the asynchronous call. Even the IHttpAction Result can be used to create custom result type. So you can implement the interface and you can create your own custom result type to handle it. Now let's move to the next question, like what are the IHttpAction Result built-in responses? So IHttpAction Result is going to return the different types of response. So built-in response are available, which are in fact helpful for returning the response in better way. So we having the OK method, we having the content, we having the JSON, we having the created method, we having the not found method, we having the bad request method, we having the conflict, internal server error, and unauthorized. So these are the various methods are available, which are helpful for preparing the response when you are returning the data from your WebAPI to action. Question answer about routing. So routing in ASP.NET Web API is similar to the routing we have in ASP.NET MVC 5. Let's start with the first question, like what is routing? So routing is a pattern matching system which monitor the incoming request and figure out what to do with that request. So ultimately when we are making the request in Web API, that comes to the server and process it based upon the requested URL. So whatever the route pattern we have registered at the API label, if there is a matching route entry, then it processes the request. So in Web API we having the message handler, that is the first step in handling the request in Web API. If the message handler figure out the existence of the available route, then it select the controller, then it use the action to process the result, and finally it return the data to the client side. Because Web API we use to return the data. In Web API we never return the view, but in MVC we use the action to return the view mainly. So this is the way how the request workflow work in ASP.NET Web API, which is looking similar to the ASP.NET MVC 5, apart from this difference like message handler and the data. So Web API action are specialized in returning the data. Let's move to the next question, like what are the different types of routing we have in ASP.NET Web API. So Web API also support two types of routing, convention based routing and attribute routing. So convention based routing we can configure in route config file, and attribute routing we can configure at the action label and controller label. Now next question is how to define the convention based routing. So in convention based routing we define a route name. So here route name we define using the map HTTP route method. Then we define the route name and the route template. And the route template usually we put the API word as a hard code, but it is not mandatory. If you are having the API as well as MVC controller at the same project, so that time the API word is going to be distinguished between the MVC routing and the API routing over there. So based upon this routing, so whatever the controller we having in the API, You can see in API we having the product controller which we are inheriting from the API controller, and here we having these method, let's say get all, get by ID, and the post. And here we have just do prefix the verb name also. So in get all we having the get verb, in the post we having the post verb, and here based upon this root template the URL would be for get all API/product. For get by ID it would be here API/product, then ID, then API/product. So here we don't need to mention the action name explicitly, because based upon the verb name and based upon this pattern we just going to identify which is the action is going to respond to the requested URL. The second way is here we can define the routing by action name. So first one was by verb name, where we have just do prefix the verb name, and the second case we mention the action name explicitly. So if you are having the multiple action with the same verb and with the almost similar URL pattern, so better way is here just don't mention the action name explicitly in the root template. So this time what we have done, we just mentioned the action name also in the root template. Now the same controller, if you are going to access by the action name convention, so now we need to mention the action name also in the URL, like API/product then get all, API/product then get by ID, then parameter, then here API/product then post. So this is the way how we can define the convention based routing. So you're having two options, one is here routing by verb name, and then the second one we having the routing by action name. So routing by action name is always helpful when you are having the multiple action which are going to respond to the get request and they having the similar action parameter as well. Now the next question is here how to define the attribute routing. So we can configure the attribute routing at the action label, but before that we need to enable it. To enable the attribute routing, there is a WebAPI config file. There we having the register method. There we need to call the map HTTP attribute routes method, so that we can enable the attribute routing in ASP.NET WebAPI. So it is also the similar style as we do in MVC 5 also. Then we define the attribute routing at action label as well as at controller label. So just use here route attribute, then define your pattern for the route over there. And now let's move to the next question, like how to define the route constant. So sometimes it is a requirement we are willing to apply some restriction when we are receiving a route parameter. So those restrictions we can apply with the help of the route constant concept. So this is the syntax for the route constant we can specify. So what are the parameter you are just going to mention in the route template, use the colon and just define your constant. Now let's understand it with the help of example. So let's say when we are having a user controller, there we having the method, let's say get user by ID, and here the ID user can pass only in integer. We are not willing to accept the ID in a string format like any other format. So I just mentioned here a route constant for integer. Similarly, we define here a route constant for the string type where the maximum length for the name can be 50 only. If it is greater than 50, it will not respond to that URL. So this is the way how we can apply the route constant in our ASP.NET Web API. We having the different types of route constant. So these are the example list, and one of them you can use as per a requirement. So first one is here for alpha constant, where we can match the uppercase and lowercase in Latin alphabet characters. The second one is a Boolean type. If you're going to apply restriction for Boolean type value, then we having for date time, then we having for decimal, double, float, we having here for GUID, integer, even we can apply the length limitation as well. So here we can expect a parameter which can have the maximum length 6, a length in a range, let's say 1,20. Then we having for long, max length. Then we having for min value, and we having here min length, a range, and the regular expression parameter. So one of the constant you can use when we are defining the route pattern in your ASP.NET Web API. Question answer about content negotiation and formatters. So ultimately WebAPI can return the data in XML and the JSON format. So how the content negotiation can be done over there? So let's start with the first question, like what is content negotiation? So content negotiation is a process of selecting the best representation of the response when the multiple representation are available. So content negotiation is handled by the following request header. So whenever you are willing to do the content negotiation, we need to mention the request header. So we having the accept header where we can mention the format of the response. So we can mention over the accept header value is application/JSON if you're willing to receive the response in JSON format. For XML, we having here application/XML. If you need the characters in a specific style, so we can mention here accept-character set, then UTF-8. For encoding also we can mention there accept-encoding. So the encoding can be gzip or like any other encoding format. If you're looking for a specific language, you can mention the language specific content negotiation as well, like EN/US, or like EN/GB, or like any other. And this is the way how we can set the request header. So this is an example over here where we are making the get request and we are setting the subheader value as application/JSON. Now let's move to the next question, like what is media type formatters? So when we make the request in ASP.NET Web API, so data we send in various format, like in JSON format, in XML format. So at the Web API level, we having the media type formatters which are responsible for serializing the request and response data. So in request, when we send the data in JSON format, so that is going to deserialize in the IPA label into the complex type. And similar way when we having a C# object like C# list, so we need to serialize the data into the JSON format or like in XML format so that we can return the response. So WebAPI supports the following built-in media type formatters. So we having here JSON media type formatter to handle the JSON format. We having the XML media type formatter to handle the XML format. Even we having the form URL encoded media type formatter to handle the HTML form URL encoded data. Because sometimes it happens you are posting the form data to the Web API. So in that case, how we can extract the data from the request. So this is the media format which help us. So these three built-in media formatters are available to handle the serialization and deserialization at the request and response level. Now let's move to the next question, like what is the circular object reference? So this is the thing you should understand when we are dealing with the serialization, the deserialization. So by default, JSON and the XML formatters serialize all the properties, like all the things at the object level. So sometimes there is a circular reference dependency occurs. It usually happens when there is a mapping between two classes. Especially this case happens in case of entity framework. So when we having the entity framework where we have defined the relationship between two entities as we have in the database level, in that case the circular reference exception has been thrown. Now let's understand it with the alpha example, like we having the employee entity and we having the department entity. So obviously employee belongs to the department and department can have a collection of employees, the collection of employees. So here in the employee class we have added the reference of department, and the department we added the reference of employee. So this is actually creating a circular reference, because whenever you are willing to fetch the data from the employee entity, it will try to select the department also. And when it's come to the department, it try to serialize the employee, then it come to the employee to department, department to employee. So there is a circular dependency is happening. So in this case, when you will try to serialize the content of either employee or department, it will throw the exception. So this is a circular object reference you should understand. The next question is here, how to handle the circular object reference. So ultimately how we can handle that error. So to handle that error, we need to ignore the reference loop in the serialization setting for Web API. So wherever we having the serialization setting for web API. So there in the application underscore start method, what are the formatters we are using? So in this example, I'm using a JSON formatter. So in the JSON formatter serialization setting, we can ignore the reference loop handling. It means don't try to serialize the content of the reference property. Only serialize the property which are not reference, means the property which are the simple type. So this is the way how we can handle the circular object reference error in ASP.NET Web API.